In continuation to my last video on existentialism, in this one I'll cover the topic of existential bad faith, that among other things can help explain how normal people can be persuaded to do terrible things. So existential bad faith is a concept that comes from Jean-Paul Sartre, just like the name existentialism. Sartre distinguishes two types of entities, subjects and objects. Subjects have some agency, right? They can act onto object, they can choose what they want to do and pursue objectives. Whereas objects are just, they don't have a will of their own and they're just acted upon or determined. And so, according to him, every human being, right, is a subject. We have our agency, we have our free will. That's a big component of existentialism, is this idea of, you know, self-determination and making a statement about who you are through your actions. There's a big emphasis on liberty. But the thing is, as we covered on the video on existentialism, the freedom in itself is a big existential stake, and it can be quite, it can be a big source of anxiety because with it comes responsibility, and you can make the wrong choice. And as we covered in other videos, there's a lot of uncertainty, so you're not sure if you're going to make the right choice. You don't know, there's a big weight that comes with, kind of taking your own destiny into your hands. To illustrate a little bit this idea, there's this quote from Steven Pressfield in The War of Art that goes, "We know that if we embrace our ideals, we must prove worthy of them, and that scares the hell out of us," which is like an illustration of the fear that comes with the existential stake of freedom. And so a lot of people pretend basically to be object. They kind of give away their will, and they just pretend to be determined to an extent. That's kind of the framing, right, at least of existential bad faith, and that is existential bad faith. It's the act of objectifying yourself by removing your own agency and let other people or other circumstances dictate what you do in order to not have to contend with the weight of responsibility that comes from your choices. But that has a lot of problems, and we're going to cover them. Now, according to a existential framework, technically existential bad faith is still a choice, as Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Ne pas choisir, c'est encore choisir," which you could roughly translate to "not choosing is still a choice." I mean, technically, a lot of philosophers have said that general idea in a lot of different ways. So let's cover some examples of how existential bad faith, or what it can look like, especially in the worst case scenarios. The gist of existential bad faith is basically the sentence, I was just following orders. Basically, this idea of delegating the choice and the act of discernment and choosing what's right or wrong and what's true or not and what should be done to another external source. It can be either other people, it could be some religious text, it could be an ideology, whatever, something else. We'll cover two pretty shocking examples, we'll say, but of some of the worst that can happen when people kind of use this frame of mind to dictate how they act. So this idea of just following order is kind of also known as under different names. One of them is a Nuremberg defense, and that's because it was used by Nazis when they were being tried. As you know, I mean, I'm not responsible for participating in the Holocaust. I was just following the orders of my superiors. One famous example of this way of thinking is Eichman, who was made famous from the book from Hannah Arendt. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to pronounce her name, and The Banality of Evil. So Eichman was this important logistic guys that helped organize the Holocaust, and so he had a big part of responsibility in a lot of the killing that were done, although he didn't partake in them himself. And basically, his entire defense was that he was just following orders, and they had ways to talk about this, and one way that existential bad faith will be expressed is through types of languages. And so one example in this case is Amtssprache, I think, which basically means like official speak, or like the language of officers, and that you're just following orders and you're just doing what you've been told. And so there's this kind of language that's based around delegating your responsibilities to something else. It's not me, I'm just doing as I'm told, I'm just following the law. And actually what was interesting with Eichmann was that he was extremely normal. Like he was like a very average person. Actually, they had six psychologists diagnose him basically, or kind of check out if he had anything weird about him. And there was nothing weird about him. Actually, according to one of the psychologists, the only weird thing about him was how he was like above, like he was so exceptionally average. That was the only noteworthy thing about Eichmann. And so that's part of the whole idea of this concept of the banality of evil, where he was just like some random guy who was just like who just followed the movement, but he didn't have any strong opinions about anything. Like he didn't strongly hate the Jews. He wasn't particularly angry at the people who were judging him. He was just like very neutral, just kind of, well, I'm just doing my job, and I don't really think that much about it. And he was actually scared, like from the questioning and the things when they talked about him, he was scared of not having anything to follow as guidance. That was something that scared him. So this kind of reliance on having this external code of conduct that he can just follow. Yeah, and so part of his demeanor was that he would use a lot of like cliches and stock phrases, and basically like any way of speaking that helps you not have to think about what you're actually saying or what it entails or the consequences. So this basically is kind of turning this act of removing your own agency and just being a follower in everything you do, like in the way you sing, the words you use, and the language you do. But even outside from this pretty specific and extreme example, like a lot of people will say that they're just following orders. They're just like, that's what everybody does, or that's the only way things can be done. And always like, it's not removing options, removing choice, and being like, this is only the only thing that can be done, and I'm just following the path. I'm just being an object that's being moved and affected by external forces. This general concept as a banality of evils that, just like normal people every day, your friendly neighbor with who you can have like a friendly average conversation could be turned into someone who would be like a major component that would help, kill millions of people, was pretty shocking. And it seemed like, yeah, it was counterintuitive, right? People were imagining that all the Nazis they would um, judge and hear in their trial would be those psychopathic monsters who were filled to the brim with hatred. But and as it happened, some of them were very just like average people, and that um, intrigued a psychologist called Milgram, who made the famous among other experiments, but that's the most famous probably is the Milgram experiment about submission to authority. And they've been questioned since because some of the ethics of doing that experiment are a little bit not incredible. But so if you've never heard about it, the general idea is that they would ask for volunteers to do a scientific experiment, and the subject that came in to do it were told that there would be studying memorization. So when they came in to do the experiment, there would be one researcher who had a lab coat, and there was another person with them, and they were told that there were two test subjects, and they were going to be randomly chosen. One would have to teach the other pairs of words, and the other would have to memorize them. And then the one who taught the pairs to the other would have to basically send them an electrical shock whenever they got a pair wrong. So, but technically, this was a fake setup because there was only one test subject. The other one was just an actor who was an accomplice to the research. And basically, what happened is that they would then be moved into two different rooms. The the teacher, who was with the researcher, would be in the same room, and he'd read the pairs to the other guy, have him remember them, and then basically ask him which was the associated word with another one. And when the one who was supposed to learn got it wrong, he would get zapped by an electrical current. That's the general principle. But basically, actually, nobody was getting actually zapped. It was just a recording tape that would always insert the same things and simulate being shocked. So basically, at every time it was just a recording. There's a little bit more moving pieces. The electrical shock went into a gradation. So they started at I think 45 volts, and then they would go up and up and up to 450 volts. At which, and there were little labels under, some of the voltage, and so it would go from mild to, okay, this is pretty painful, to, okay, this is getting pretty dangerous. And the idea was every time the guy who was being tested made a mistake, the actual test subject was supposed to click on the button to zap them, and every time they had to do it one level of intensity higher. And so the actual test, right, was to check submission to authority. So how far would people go? How far would they zap the other person? Now they weren't technically doing it, but from what they could understand, were actually zapping another person who could have been them if they had been chosen randomly differently. According to what they had been told, it could have been either one of them that was being tested. And so yeah, so at the very beginning they got zapped to with the lowest voltage, so 45, to get an idea of the sensation it did. And then they would start doing the process, so teaching words, and whenever the other test subject, which you can only hear their voice, would get it wrong, they would press on the button and send them an electrical shock. And basically, there were a few other things that would happen. So the other person who was getting shocked, technically it was just a recording, right, would start making sounds of pain the higher you went, and then would ask to stop. And at the very end, he got silent, and which was eerily silent. And if the person being tested would start to falter or hesitate because that's kind of messed up what they were doing, the researcher in their lab coat representing authority had four sentences that they had to tell them, to basically tell them, oh, you've got to do this, or keep doing it, and you have no choice. There was like a little sequence of phrases they had, and they were there to represent authority. And so the idea was to see how many people would how many people would stop and basically say, oh, this is wrong, I can't keep doing this, and who would go up to the end. And the results were quite shocking. Every single person that was tested in that first batch went up to 300 volts, and then some started being, okay, no, this is too much. And 65% of people went up to the maximum level. So basically blasted the person with the max level of voltage, which was technically like potentially lethal. And so that was also a pretty shocking experiment. It's been done a few times afterwards, and I think overall the results are pretty similar. There are some factors that change how much people, depending on how you change a little bit, some factors of the experiment. So if there's other people to influence, or depending on how close or far from the person that's being electrocuted there's like some differences, but generally this seems to be a pretty standard distribution. Everyone, 100% of people go pretty far, and then like more than half go up to the far level. And so this was a pretty shocking a pretty shocking experiment that made a lot of noise, because while as I just went to show that perfectly average people could be led pretty quickly to do pretty terrible things, as long as there was some kind of figure of authority that pressured them a little bit through peer pressure and a couple of sentences, that was enough to get them to potentially kill someone else, and definitely like zap them over and over with an electrical current. Interestingly enough, something that had a factor on which type of people would keep going or would rebel was actually agreeableness. So agreeable people, which is usually seen as a good thing, but tend to actually follow the directives more often, or at least further, right? So whereas people that tend to be more disagreeable would tend to rebel quicker, we'll say. Another thing that would also play a factor was whether someone had previous experiences. There's kind of an inoculation process that happens where if you have been in this type of situation before in the past, and you've kind of felt guilt and had time to reflect and think, well, I shouldn't have done that, then it's more likely that you will stop quicker. So that's another thing that plays a role in the results. Another factor that plays a big role, and that's seen in other social psychology studies, is if there's like someone else that stands up. So for example, if you've got spectators or something, anyway, if someone else voices their dissent and say, whoa, this is messed up, you should stop, then it becomes a lot easier for the person that's being tested to say, okay, wait, actually I agree with the guy who's dissenting, and this is not okay. So that has a big impact in these types of situation, and it's not necessarily this exact one-to-one situation, but in a situation of like massive injustice that's basically rationalized away because it's like the accepted authority or the general way of thinking tolerates it. If like just one or a few people start speaking about it, then it helps bring all the other person that were kind of hesitating. So that's an important thing to know. And it's good. I mean, obviously it's scary because you need to be pretty brave to be the first person to speak up and try to stop things, but it does have an impact. That's a topic I'll talk about in probably more in the future. But anyway, to bring us back to the idea of existential bad faith, right? You can see that a lot of people are used, maybe it's through the weird, well, I mean, through our social nature, but also maybe the way we were raised and educated, to basically delegate a lot of responsibility and assessing what's right or wrong and what is worthy of being trusted or not to commonly accepted figures of authorities, and that's a dangerous thing. Like, and that's why I would like to stress that you should try not to fall into the trap of existential bad faith, and instead try to always analyze things from a critical perspective and try to think does this actually make sense, um, and try to evaluate things from your own moral point of view, right? To stay connected with your own humanity. And because like most people, right, when they're in this situation, they're very uncomfortable. It's pretty stressful, and they want to get out. They don't really know it's wrong, but they just go with it because they feel like they're supposed to. So that's something to pay attention to, and to try to listen more to that internal voice than some random guy in a position of power. And if you think about it, I think these types of dynamics of responsibility dilution, or you kind of like you kind of let someone else take the responsibility and the agency in general. That's what enables a lot of massive scale evil. Because if you think about it, how many evil psychopathic mass murderers are there? What percentage of the population do they represent? Probably not that much. There's, even if they have the potential to do a lot of harm, they're still super rare. So the only way they can actually start doing some real level of destruction, is when they start convincing a lot of other people to go along with their plans. And so if people were less likely to just go along with whatever everyone else is doing, and you know try to really mull it over themselves, then this would be less of a risk. And that's why it's really important to not fall into the trap of existential bad faith, and to try to always consider your own agency, or your own sense of what seems right, and to really think about it, and yeah, and not to be too quick to relinquish responsibility. And not only is it good in general for society, but it's also good for yourself, because that's the best way to actually create meaningful fulfillment. It is scary to assume the responsibility for the choices we make, and risk being potentially wrong, or harming people, or making a mistake. But at the end of the day, it's really important to try to do your best, and to always not to be too quick to discard your agency, because it's one of the most important things you have, and it's also what will allow you to find the most fulfillment, as the existential school of thought uh, asserts. And if you want to learn more about this, you can watch my previous video on existentialism. All right, I hope you found this video interesting. I'll put links where you can read a little bit more about the different topics I mentioned in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.